Let me ask you something kind of uncomfortable. When was the last time you were lying in bed at night, completely exhausted, but your brain just wouldn't shut up? Replaying a conversation from 3 days ago? Worrying about something that hasn't even happened yet? Telling yourself you're not good enough, smart enough, or ready enough? We've all been there. And here's the crazy part. Nobody taught your brain to do that. It just does it on its own, constantly. So what if the problem isn't your life? What if the problem isn't your job, your relationship, your bank account, or any of the stuff you've been blaming? What if the problem is that you've been believing your thoughts without ever questioning whether they're actually true? That's what this book is about, and honestly, it might be one of the most important things you watch this year. Hey, welcome back. Today we're breaking down Don't Believe Everything You Think by Joseph Nguyen. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I first heard the title, I kind of rolled my eyes.
Another self-help
Sounds
book?
like something you'd see on a motivational poster, right? But I picked it up anyway, and within the first 20 pages, I had to put it down and just sit with what I'd read. Because Nguyen isn't telling you to think positive. He's not giving you a 5-step morning routine or a journaling hack. He's making a much bigger, much bolder claim. He's saying that thinking itself and the very act of having thoughts and believing them is the root cause of almost all human suffering. Not your circumstances, not other people, not bad luck, your thinking. And look, I know that sounds like a lot, but stick with me. Because the way he breaks this down actually makes complete sense by the end. And more importantly, it gives you a completely different way to move through your day. We're going to cover 5 big ideas from this book. By the time we're done, you're going to look at your own mind a little differently. Let's get into it. Part 1, you are not your thoughts. All right, so the very first thing Nguyen wants you to understand is this. You are not your thoughts. And I know, that sounds simple, maybe even obvious. But here's the thing. Most of us don't actually live like that's true. Think about what happens when you wake up Monday morning and the first thought that pops into your head is, I don't want to go to work. Most people immediately attach to that thought. They believe it. They build a whole mood around it. By the time they're in the shower, they've already decided the whole day is going to be terrible. But here's a question Nguyen wants you to sit with. Did you choose that thought? Like, did you sit up in bed and consciously decide, you know what, I'm going to think something negative right now? No, it just showed up. And that's his whole point. We have somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 thoughts every single day. And the vast majority of them we didn't choose. They just appear. They surface from somewhere deep in our subconscious, shaped by our past experiences, our fears, our conditioning, the things we've been told since we were kids. So if you didn't choose those thoughts, why are you treating them like facts? Nguyen uses this analogy that I love. He says, imagine you're sitting on the bank of a river. Leaves are floating past on the water. You don't jump in and grab every single leaf. You just watch them go by. That's what thoughts are. They float past. The problem is, most of us have been trained, without even realizing it, to jump into the river and grab every single leaf. To hold on tight and say, this one's mine. This one defines me. And the moment you grab that leaf, the moment you say, I am anxious, instead of I'm noticing an anxious thought, you've become the thought. You've given it your full identity. Now here's what makes this practical, not just philosophical. The moment you start seeing your thoughts as things that pass through you, rather than things that are you, you create a little bit of distance, a tiny gap. And in that gap, you have a choice. You can choose whether to believe the thought, whether to act on it, whether to keep holding it or let it float on by. That's not positivity. That's not pretending things are fine when they're not. It's just accuracy. You're being accurate about what a thought actually is. And that shift alone, and just that one shift in perspective, can change everything about how your day feels. Part 2, thinking is the source of suffering. Okay, so now we get to the idea that made me put the book down. Nguyen makes this claim, and it's a bold one. Almost all psychological suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from what we think about what happens to us. Let me say that again because it's worth letting it land. It's not your circumstances creating your suffering, it's your thinking about your circumstances. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That can't be right. Some things are genuinely hard. Some things genuinely hurt. And you're absolutely right. Pain is real. Loss is real. Grief is real. But Nguyen makes a distinction between pain and suffering. Pain is the immediate, raw experience. You lose your job, that stings. Someone you love gets sick, that hurts. That's pain. It's real, and he's not dismissing it. Suffering is what happens next. It's the stories we layer on top. This always happens to me. I'll never recover from this. I must have done something to deserve this. My life is ruined. That's the part that's made of thought. Here's an example he uses that really drove it home for me. 2 people get laid off from the same company on the same day. Same job, same circumstances. One of them spirals into months of depression. The other one updates their LinkedIn that same evening and starts reaching out to their network. Same event. Completely different experience. What's the difference? It's not intelligence. It's not work ethic. It's not even luck at that point. It's the story each person is telling themselves about what that event means. The first person is thinking, "This proves I wasn't good enough. Nobody is going to want to hire me. This is the beginning of the end." The second person is thinking, "Okay, that chapter is done. What's next?" Neither of those thoughts is objectively more true than the other. They're both interpretations. They're both stories. But one of those stories leads to paralysis, and one leads to momentum. And Nguyen's point is, you get to choose which story you hold on to. Now, this doesn't mean toxic positivity. It doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel good when you don't. It means recognizing that the story is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. Especially when it doesn't feel like one. Because once you see it as a choice, you have power. And power is the one thing suffering takes away from you. Part 3. Why fighting your thoughts doesn't work. So at this point you might be thinking, okay, I get it. I need to think better thoughts. I need to challenge my negative thinking and replace it with positive thinking. And I totally understand why that feels like the logical next step. But Nguyen says, nope, that's not it. And not only does it not work, it actually makes things worse. Here's why. When you try to fight a thought, when you go to war with it, you're giving it all of your attention. You're treating it like a threat serious enough to battle. And the mind interprets that as, this must be important. So it holds on tighter. You know how when someone says, don't think about a pink elephant? That's immediately all you can think about? Same principle. The harder you push against a thought, the more power you give it. There's actually a lot of research in psychology to back this up. A psychologist named Daniel Wegner ran studies on what he called thought suppression and consistently found that people who tried not to think about something ended up thinking about it more than people who were just allowed to think it freely. So what do you do instead? Nguyen says, you don't fight the thought. You don't try to replace it. You don't argue with it or convince yourself it's wrong. You just notice it. That's it. You simply observe it. There's a phrase he uses that I've actually started saying to myself in the middle of stressful moments, and it sounds weird, but it genuinely helps. He suggests you just mentally note, there's that thought again. Not, I need to stop thinking this. Not, why do I keep thinking this? What's wrong with me? Just, oh, there's that thought. What that does is it puts you back in the observer seat. You're not the river. You're the person sitting on the bank again. The thought is just a leaf floating past. And here's the beautiful thing. When you stop fighting a thought, when you stop treating it like an emergency, it tends to lose its charge. It gets quieter. Not because you forced it out, but because you stopped feeding it. This is actually similar to what happens in meditation, in mindfulness practice, in certain types of therapy. The technique isn't to fix your thoughts. It's to change your relationship to your thoughts. And that is a fundamentally different project, and a way easier one, honestly. Part 4, the gap between thought and action. Okay, this next idea might be my favorite in the whole book, and it's something that sounds almost too simple, but it has real, practical weight to it. Nguyen talks about something he calls the gap. Between every thought you have and every action you take, there is a moment, a tiny space, a pause, and he says, your whole life is built inside that gap. Let me give you a real scenario. You send your boss an important proposal on Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, you still haven't heard back, and your brain starts going, they hated it, I'm probably getting fired. Why did I even try? I should have known better. Now in that moment, you have a choice. You can believe that story and act from it. Maybe you walk into work looking defeated, avoid your boss, maybe even preemptively start disaster spiraling. Or you can notice the thought, recognize it as a story, and act from a more grounded place. Maybe you just wait. The event is the same, the thought is the same, but in that gap, in that tiny moment between the thought arising and you doing something about it, there's a version of you that has way more control than you think. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust and wrote Man's Search for Meaning, said something that Nguyen echoes. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our freedom. That's the gap. Now here's the honest part. Most of us have been living our whole lives without ever knowing that gap exists. We've been on autopilot, letting thoughts trigger reactions instantly. Something happens. We feel it. We react. No gap, no pause, no choice. That's why people say things they regret. That's why people make decisions in fear that they wouldn't make in calm. That's why we ghost people instead of having honest conversations, or blow up instead of setting a boundary calmly. The gap gets skipped. But the good news? You can train yourself to find it. And the way you do that is exactly what Nguyen has been building toward this whole time, by learning to observe your thoughts instead of becoming them. The more you practice noticing your thoughts, the wider that gap gets. And the wider the gap gets, the more freedom you have in a moment, in a conversation, in a relationship, in your career. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Part 5. Come back to the present. All right, the last big idea, and it ties everything together. Nguyen says that almost all psychological suffering lives in one of two places, the past or the future. Think about it. Guilt lives in the past. Regret lives in the past. Shame lives in the past. I should have done this differently. Why did I say that? I can't believe I let that happen. Anxiety lives in the future. Worry lives in the future. Dread lives in the future. What if this goes wrong? What if they leave? What if I fail? Neither of those places is where you actually are right now. Right now, in this moment, you're just here, reading this, breathing, existing. And Nguyen's argument is that the present moment is almost always okay. Not perfect, not everything you want it to be. But okay, safe enough, manageable. The suffering comes from leaving it, from spending your mental energy in a past you can't change or a future you can't control. Now, he's not saying just be present and all your problems disappear. That would be naive. Real problems need real solutions. Real grief needs real time. But what he is saying is that the extra suffering, the unnecessary layer of pain we add on top of actual hardship that comes from the mind's addiction to wandering. And the antidote, pun absolutely intended, is just to come back. Not to force happiness, not to pretend, just to return to what's actually happening right now. What do you see in front of you? What do you feel in your body? What's real right now, in this actual moment? That practice, that returning, is something you can do anywhere. On the subway, in a difficult meeting, at 2 a.m. when your brain won't let you sleep. You don't have to fix the thought. You don't have to solve the problem right now. You just have to come back to this moment. And then the next one. And then the one after that. That's it. That's the whole practice. So let's bring it all home. Here's what Joseph Nguyen wants you to walk away with from this book. 1. You are not your thoughts. They are things that pass through you, not things that define you. 2. Your suffering comes not from life itself, but from the stories you tell yourself about life, and stories can be rewritten. 3. Don't fight your negative thoughts. Just notice them, observe them, let them float by without grabbing on. 4. Between every thought and every action, there is a gap. That gap is where your freedom lives. Find it, protect it, use it. And 5. When things feel overwhelming, come back to right now. The present moment is almost always safer than where your mind is trying to take you. This isn't a complicated book, but it's one of those books where the simplicity is the point. The ideas are easy to understand and genuinely hard to practice, and that's exactly what makes them worth practicing. If this breakdown was helpful, go ahead and subscribe. Every week we do this. Take books like this one and break them down into ideas you can actually use in your real life. No fluff, no filler. I'll see you in the next one.